In last year's video, I talked about Independence Day, what it means, and how the Founding Fathers shamed the early colonists out of sexual, social, and racial freedom. We took a quick look at how government intervention has affected the history of freedom. This year, I want to continue talking about it because there's so much to be covered still. Let's look at the first 10 years of the United States of America and compare it with our definition of independence. The recognition of the fact that yours is the responsibility of judgment and nothing can help you escape it. Ayn Rand. We all know who the first president was, and many of us know of his unanimous election to the office and the famous story about his wooden teeth, which actually weren't wooden, and his requirement that he not be called a king. But do you know the institutions for which Washington is responsible? No? Let's take a look. George Washington first created the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is today called the Department of State. The Department of State is responsible for international relations of the United States, equivalent to the foreign ministry of other countries. Since its creation, the institution of government has controlled the equal and fair trade of goods across the border of the United States. How has this worked out? Several embargo acts later, we are still unable to trade with some countries because the government of the United States deems them to be either a threat to national security or because of hostilities with their leadership. When trade becomes subject to the whims of those in government, we are unable to have open and fair trade. Open and fair trade would result in lower prices and therefore a lower poverty rate. When competition is not supported to its fullest, we see the price of goods increase because there is lower supply, higher demand, and that results in people being able to charge almost any price they want. This is called a monopoly, and our Department of State is key in helping create monopolies on imports and certain goods into our country by making deals with their friends abroad. It's really just a game of popularity who gets to sell their goods inside the United States. You piss off the king, you get the axe. That's not to mention the countless wars that the State Department and War Department, also created by Washington, has approved and furthered. War has a similar effect to limited trade. It creates poverty after the war is over. Unlike the Keynesians would have you believe, war only stimulates the economy on the surface, creating only temporary jobs that will not last when the war is over. Once we are no longer in conflict, losing countless innocent lives in what is mostly a conflict over the control of oil, those people who were employed now have nowhere to go and have developed no skills that are sustainable in a peacetime economy. These are just two of the major problems that the Department of State causes. There are many others. Washington also created the Treasury Department, which quickly led to the development of the first Bank of the United States. Now, many will be asking, how can this be a bad thing? Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of State, described this development as a means of increasing financial order. And that means progress, right? Organization is not good for just organization's sake. The truth is, a monopoly on federal currency actually is a major root of ongoing poverty in the United States. It is illegal to barter, which would actually help many of the impoverished individuals who often have very little goods to their name, but could still trade for things that they make to buy food that they need. It also causes a climb in the poverty rate through its gradual and steady printing of currency. Since moving away from the gold standard, government has been printing money with increasingly less value. Now, why is this currency worth less? Because the more of any good you have, even money, the less each unit is worth. If corn is being overgrown and everyone has access to it, very few people are going to pay a high price for 1 ear of corn. Versus if corn is scarce, people will pay much more to obtain it if they desire it. This is true for all goods, even money. When money is printed, there is more in circulation, and the poor, because they are often without a good paying job, can't earn enough of the money that is circulating to pay for the food that they need. This is why central banking practices have such a major impact on the poverty rate in America, and why many wise people are now pushing for new decentralized currencies that are finite, like Bitcoin. One last note. The Treasury Department is also responsible for collecting all of those taxes Americans love. To think that Washington, the first president, was so ready to collect taxes after writing, "For imposing taxes on us without our consent," as one of the reasons for declaring independence from Britain in the Declaration of Independence. This move just reeks of absolute hypocrisy. Believe it or not, Washington was also an advocate for the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, an act requiring anyone who found an African American who had run away from his master to return the property to its owner. independence should be something shared by all. And with thousands of American lives shackled for the first 100 years of our country, there seems to be very little to celebrate in regards to independence. A control of the money supply, a popularity contest for supplying goods and services, a growing poverty rate, and an insistence that a whole race was property? I don't know about you, but this doesn't seem like someone who believed much in independence. But maybe it got better. Maybe John Adams turned it all around. Let's take a look. John Adams was the United States' second president and one of the greatest advocates for freedom from Great Britain in all of history. Surely his presidency would be one in keeping with the tradition of independence. But how do we explain the Alien and Sedition Acts? Many know it as being the early requirements for citizenship in the United States, and while those laws are not too disagreeable, the sedition part is the one most people forget. Though it would only last 2 years, the Alien and Sedition Acts were responsible for a limiting of freedom of speech, a right we often take for granted in the United States. During times of war, it had become illegal for citizens of the United States to speak out against the American government outside of what are labeled free speech zones. And if we can't speak out, how can we ever hope to affect change in our lifetime? Any restriction on any part of the Bill of Rights should be thought of as absolute tyranny. Adams had fought to break the shackles of oppressive British government, and here he was turning the oppression right around on the very people he had helped to free. Once he had a taste of political power, Adams clearly had a change of heart about the liberties of the American people. The next president to stand trial for crimes against independence couldn't deserve it more. Thomas Jefferson had a large hand in raising the poverty rate between 1801 and 1809, with his fierce restrictions on trade through both the Embargo Acts, which put a temporary halt on all foreign trade, the Agampre Act, which was even more strict and had a devastating impact on New England's economy, and the Non-Intercourse Act, after the Embargo Acts had been repealed, closed the U.S. ports to France and England, halting our supply of certain foods and other goods and limiting competition. Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury, Albert Gallatin, understood the consequences even then, stating in a letter to Jefferson, "And it is not without much hesitation that a statesman should hazard to regulate the concerns of individuals as if he could do it better than themselves." As I pointed out before, limiting free trade raises the poverty rate by decreasing supply and making goods more expensive to acquire. This limits many of the essential liberties that middle and upper class citizens take for granted. If there's not independence for those who are poor, then can we really call ourselves a nation of independence? Remember, this is also the father of the Declaration of Independence, who wrote as one of the reasons for separation from Britain, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, hypocrisy at its finest. James Madison is our next president on trial. However, his strikes against liberty were mostly unoriginal and often somewhat accidental, including his reluctant furthering of Alexander Hamilton's version of the central bank and the embargo laws that Jefferson had set precedent for. The precedent for the first prime example of how one act by government can result in centuries of oppressive government oversight. Laws that seem helpful in the beginning could later be interpreted to take away even the most basic of human rights. Madison accepted, though I will give him credit, it was with reluctance, Macon's Bill No. 2, which allowed French and English imports but caused Americans to lose trade with any warring powers. This embargo didn't just increase the poverty rate, it created a rule that any country who was in any conflict with the U.S. government would be punished through elimination of trade. This law creates a precedent for centuries of increased poverty rates and difficulty for new technology to enter the United States because of government beefs that have nothing to do with individual people or companies in either the United States or any country. If you believe that isolationism is bad, consider the negative effects of cutting off trade with other countries who are advanced in technology. Think how far we would fall behind if we limited trade with countries like Japan and China, host of some of the most technologically innovative businesses in the world. Madison also banned British imports and exports, limiting not only the goods we receive from Britain against rising costs on goods, but limited the income the United States made on trades with Britain. Champion for independence and liberty? Hardly. Some Americans would say, but the government was just protecting us, keeping us safe. That's their job. But when someone like Benjamin Franklin, inventor of things like the stove and the discoverer of electricity, says those who are willing to sacrifice essential liberty for safety deserve neither liberty nor safety, maybe those Americans should listen. Madison's presidency is a prime example of how the small government ideals laid out in the Constitution will ultimately be sacrificed for the sake of expediency, especially in times of crisis. Monroe was also responsible for several crimes against independence. During the Panic of 1819, the Second Bank of the United States, itself deeply enmeshed in these inflationary practices, sought to compensate for its laxness in regulating the state bank credit market by initiating a sharp curtailment in loans by its western branches beginning in 1818. Failing to provide metallic currency when presented with their own banknotes by the BUS, the state-chartered banks began foreclosing on the heavily mortgaged farms and business properties they had financed. The ensuing financial panic, in conjunction with a sudden recovery in European agricultural production in 1817, led to widespread bankruptcies and mass unemployment. This was the first time citizens of the United States became politically active to oppose central banking. How have we somehow become so apathetic or so ignorant of the fact that central banking causes poverty and financial crisis? During McCulloch versus Maryland, the state of Maryland had attempted to impede operation of a branch of the Second Bank of the United States by imposing a tax on all notes of banks not chartered in Maryland. Though the law, by its language, was generally applicable to all banks not chartered in Maryland, the Second Bank of the United States was the only out-of-state bank that existed in Maryland, and the law was recognized in the court's opinion as having specifically targeted the Bank of the United States. The court invoked the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution, which allowed the federal government to pass laws not expressly provided for in the Constitution's list of express powers, provided those laws are in useful furtherance of the express powers of Congress under the Constitution. This case created a precedent of federal power abuse that would continue throughout our history. Congress has used the necessary and proper clause to violate several rights and pass multiple pieces of legislation that the 10th Amendment would have otherwise prohibited. For example, federal tax lien and collect laws, record-keeping, reporting, and filing requirements, and civil and criminal penalties for non-payment are not themselves exertions of Congress's power to tax, but are laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the federal taxing power. In other words, the necessary and proper clause allow Congress to exert penalties over people for not paying taxes. Monroe was also the last piece of the puzzle for the Trail of Tears, rounding him off as an aggressor against the independence and freedom of the U.S.'s early history. The John Quincy Adams administration had very little negative impact on liberty, and for that I will give him credit. He actually didn't do much of anything. His cabinet was fairly uncooperative, so his actions were mostly thwarted, but this to me is an example of a great president, one that affects nothing. One of the most ruthless of the first 10 executive administrations of the United States was the 7th, Andrew Jackson's. He was considered to be not a very friendly man in general, but he seemed less friendly when he threatened to deploy troops if South Carolina annulled the federally imposed protection tariffs the government had imposed. He had a way of violating the 10th Amendment that could easily be compared to Lincoln's. He also made it temporarily illegal for any state to secede or nullify any federal law. Many states today have reclaimed the right to secede, such as New Hampshire, but it becomes increasingly harder to nullify federal laws. This is devastating for a country that is founded on sovereignty of a state's rights in most matters. Needless to say, from the get-go, Jackson was a violator of independence and freedom for the states and for the people. For example, Jackson was the president who passed the Indian Removal Act, resulting in the Trail of Tears, a long journey that American Indians had to make from their homeland to reservations, designated plots of land for them to live on. They were treated as poorly as the slaves, only because of the color of their skin. Jackson also supported the Fugitive Slave Act, which I mentioned before required anyone that found a slave who had escaped from their master to have the property returned to their owner. I will reiterate, we can't call it independence when it is limited only to white males. Thousands of people in chains for the first 100 years of this country, and we celebrate. Last but not least, Jackson passed the Force Bill, authorizing the Army to enforce all federal laws. When our country began, the Founding Fathers opposed Britain's quartering of soldiers in people's homes and arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule to these colonies. How can we claim to be independent when every year of our country's existence we grow closer and closer to becoming the parent country that we opposed and and separated from? How can our government commit the same offenses, and when true patriots stand up and fight for freedom, we tell them, even on a day to celebrate the treason of our founders, that they are treasonous, as if this is a bad thing. Treason is what created our freedom and what can potentially gain it back in a system that reeks of the tyranny of our parent country. Martin Van Buren is often blamed for the Panic of 1937, but that crisis actually grew out of a long-standing political issues with other countries, causing them to raise interest rates and in turn causing the U.S. to have to do so as well. The panic was the culmination of years of bad foreign policy, embargoes, and wars. Banks collapsed, businesses failed, prices declined, and thousands of workers lost their job. Unemployment may have been as high as 25% in some locales. The years 1837 to 1844 were generally speaking years of deflation in wages and prices. These, of course, raised the poverty rate significantly, which, of course, resulted in less independence than ever before in America. To Van Buren's credit, though, he did resist to use government excessive intervention to address the crisis, but at this point in American history, we see that even presidents could suffer from unwise foreign and monetary policies of the past. William Henry Harrison died in his first month of office. There's nothing to say of him as president. As far as what he would have done, we can only speculate, but that is not what this particular video is about. John Tyler took over, also known as His Excellency. He was the first president to take over from the office of vice president. He was loathed by Congress and his cabinet, so many resigned, and other than ending the Seminole Wars, he was a do-nothing president. President James K. Polk was known for one crime against independence: the Department of the Interior and all its little branches. There are two in particular that deserve to be discussed: the General Land Office, today known as the Bureau of Land Management, and the Patent Office, today known as the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The General Land Office was created to oversee public land, aka land that can't be sold to the people. Biggest issue with public land is that it increases the scarcity of buyable land, and as I have said many times before, this creates higher price demand for the available land. This limits the amount of people who can buy land either by scarcity or by its high cost. This means more people without homes for them and their budding families. Also, the use of public land has over the years become a facade. The government pretends to use land to preserve wildlife. Numerous studies show that this land is not only more costly to the public than private wildlife reserves are to the individual that owns them, but that often these preserves are not as well kept as private reserves. Finally, many times you see a plot of public land, it has not been public since the government's inception. Oftentimes, the public land has been acquired through a process of eminent domain, where the government, if they cannot persuade the person to give up the land willingly, will take the land by force, even if it contains someone's home, farm, or livelihood. After all, it's really all just public land. We're only renting space, and we are reminded every year when we pay our property taxes on the land we supposedly bought already. When we can't even feel secure in owning our own land and property, when it can be forcibly taken from us through the big agency of government at any time, is that independent? The second office is the Patent Office. Many people ask, how can you be against the ability to protect your ideas? But this is not the whole story about patents. Patents, other than being extremely costly to enforce, costing upward of $100,000 in court, creating a monopoly on ideas that's only attainable to the rich, also is expensive to an innocent victim to defend themselves. But this is not the biggest issue with patents. Patents have a way of limiting innovation, imposing hundreds of billions of dollars in costs on the economy every year. Say you have an idea for a new type of vacuum cleaner. I find out about your idea and I improve on it. If you sue me and win, the market is now denied the right to a better product. Or more likely, the patentee enforces a license fee from the improver, and that just increases costs and prices to the public. If someone independently invents a similar improved vacuum cleaner without even knowing of my patent, he can still be sued and enforced to stop selling or to pay a royalty fee, extortion, ransom, whatever you want to call it, to the patentee. The patent is the lazy man's way of competing without competing. The entire purpose of a patent grant is to let the inventor stop competition and rest on his laurels by charging monopoly prices for his earlier innovation. So he has less incentive to innovate because he can just rest on his laurels, and competitors have less incentive to innovate since it's riskier. Yes, eventually Eventually they expire, but in the meantime, the public has to be deprived of a new idea, maybe even something that can improve lives, until the 20 or so years are up, just so that the person who came up with the lesser product but patented it first, or had the money to patent it first, could make a lot of money through the lazy process of having a monopoly. When you have a monopoly, nobody can compete, so why improve it? Can a country hope to have technological independence or freedom of innovation when patents limit the growth potential of the United States economy? This is how Polk and the still existing Department of the Interior limit our freedom even today. Zachary Taylor also passed away after a very brief stint as the President of the United States. In the time he was president, he passed no laws and vetoed no bills. Fillmore is the last president I will cover in this documentary. Fillmore repeated two central mistakes of those before him. He recreated the United States Bank, responsible for the inflation of the dollar and the increasing poverty rate that continues even today. Americans are a slave to the owner of the banks, the Federal Reserve, because with every dollar that is printed in the United States currency, this private entity called the Federal Reserve requires payment for labor and calculates interest on all the money that the Americans and the government will someday owe back. Nobody knows when, but it could happen any day. Much like that guy who loaned you money and is sending out a bounty hunter to collect your debt. Only problem is, how do we pay back all the money in the entire United States to the people who own it and then pay interest? We owe more than exists thanks to the monopolization of the US dollar. This is just one kind of slavery Fillmore gave us. He also passed the Fugitive Slave Act, officially requiring African American property to be returned to their owners, once again denying independence to thousands of lives shackled in chains. This is what the celebration of the 4th of July includes, folks. Still feel like celebrating? And I promise it won't get better with the next 10. And this doesn't even cover all of the wars that were started in America's first half century. That would take too long, but let's take a look at how war affects the economy. Despite popular theories that have asserted that war stimulates the economy, it actually does the opposite. As I said before, here is what actually happens. Unlike Keynesians would have you believe, war only stimulates the economy on the surface, creating only temporary jobs that will not last once the war is over. Once we are no longer in conflict, losing countless innocent lives in what is mostly a conflict over the control of oil, those people who were employed now have nowhere to go and have developed no skills that are sustainable in a peacetime economy, resulting in less independence in the long run, but they keep justifying it because it causes a temporary prosperity as it's going on. But hey, if you want to sacrifice the future for a little happiness in the present, to destroy your children's future for a little fake economic growth, thanks, I guess, because my generation is a culmination of every time the United States government has decided to do that. Doesn't seem like that's a lot of independence, does it? Having to pay off the debt of mistakes made before I was even born. Now let's look at the definition of independence again. Independence is the recognition of the fact that yours is the responsibility of judgment and nothing can help you escape it. Ayn Rand. Did our government take away our responsibility of judgment? If they did, they are denying us the basic human right of independence, which should be fought for vigorously by those who are passionate about this country. So we talk to those who were so passionate that they showed up for a celebration in Manchester, New Hampshire. Let's see what they know and have to say about our independence, our freedom. So I took to the streets with Macy Tomlin and Adam Kokesh as our cameraman to see how much people on the streets knew about the presidents they were celebrating on the 4th of July and the history surrounding this day. Hi, I'm Buren. What's your name? Mike. Pleased to meet you, Mike. So, who passed the embargo acts? It was actually Jefferson. And so, do you know anything about the embargo acts and what they did? The early embargo acts?
Does that have something to do with the tea?
No. So the embargo acts actually limited trade with France and Britain, and made it so that the U.S. citizens couldn't get the same goods and services, and actually prices were raised on the goods and services they need because trade wasn't as free.
My name's Macy. What are you guys' names?
Sierra. Erica.
How are you enjoying your 4th of July?
It's beautiful out.
It is. It's beautiful here in New Hampshire. So the first question I have is, what president passed the Indian Removal Act?
George Washington?
George Washington?
Yeah.
No. Andrew Jackson. And do you guys know how this by any chance limited some freedoms for us in the United States? or what it was about at all?
No.
So it forced Native Americans onto reservations through coercion and force.
Oh, those still exist, don't they?
Yes.
Kind of.
Yep. The act is still not, obviously we're not forcing people onto reservations anymore, but it was a law that was passed that limited some freedoms.
First question. Who passed the Alien and Sedition Acts?
Madison.
No, it was actually John Adams, but good guess. What's interesting about the Alien and Sedition Acts is it was actually in effect for 2 years, and do you actually know what the Alien and Sedition Acts did?
It allowed aliens into the country.
Yes, it also did that, but what's interesting about it is it created laws that made it difficult for people to speak ill of the government during wartime. So it severely limited one of our essential freedoms here in America. So not such a good thing.
Which president supported the Fugitive Slave Act?
Lincoln?
I will take that answer. Also Millard Fillmore. And do you know anything about that act?
No, I don't.
Okay, so pretty much it required people to return runaway slaves to their masters due to the fact that they were property.
Who presided over the Panic of 1819? Yeah.
Over the Panic of 1819, I would have to say, I could say Jackson. I don't know.
You were close. It's Monroe.
Oh, that was my first answer.
Yeah, it was your
I knew it was
first
in there
answer.
for something.
So, the Panic of 1819, do you know anything about it and what happened?
No, I don't.
Okay, so the Panic of 1819, there was a big inflation because of the Neapolitanic Wars, and it greatly limited people's freedom by not allowing them to use the same amount of currency that they were previously using because of the great inflation of the dollar. I was really starting to lose hope until I met this family.
What president passed the Embargo Act? Take a wild guess.
Thomas Jefferson?
Yes, it was Thomas Jefferson, right? Yes. All right. I didn't write the first name down. So he limited the trade between France and Britain, and that raised the price of goods for people, so they weren't able to, get the goods that they wanted or needed. And so no competition means that prices go up pretty much.
I don't know about you, but this kid gives me hope for the future. What's the saying? Those who don't know about history are doomed to repeat it. But now it was time to ask the hard questions. So do you think that we're free, and why or why not?
Do we think of New Hampshire or just us as in general?
Just the United States in general.
I don't necessarily think we're free. I think some freedoms we have, but I don't think we're completely free. No.
It's a pretty deep question.
Yeah, it is deep.
Really
yeah.
get on a roll as far as free.
Yeah, we definitely have some freedoms, but a lot of stuff we don't. Which is tough. Yeah.
The society is governed. It's not entirely free.
Right.
That's a very good answer. I really like that answer.
Yes and no.
Can you explain that a little further?
Obviously, we do have rights and whatnot, but when you have the likes of the NSA and whatnot snooping, so one of my favorite quotes from Ben Franklin is, "Give up a literal liberty for security, you will achieve neither."
Definitely agree.
We're probably more free than other people, but we're not totally free.
Why would you say that?
Because we're not allowed to do things that are like, I can understand doing things that would harm other people, but we're not allowed to do everything that we want to that won't harm other people.
Agreed.
How do you express your freedom?
Freedom of speech. I'm allowed to say what I want and I want. It's just a great right to have being an American.
And you do that?
Yeah.
Awesome. That's good.
But then it became time to ask the hardest question of all. And how do you think our lives would be different if we were still part of Great Britain? Everybody loves this question.
I think if we were still part of Great Britain, we would
we would have a lot less ability to do and govern ourselves and do what we want, what's best. You can't have someone who's on the other side of the ocean dictate what's best for you. They don't know this land, they don't know these people, and we would be in a lot, it would be a lot more cumbersome for us. So it wouldn't be as open.
Okay, agreed. So, how do you think our lives would be different if we were still part of Great Britain?
God. We'd be Mexico.
We'd be Mexico. Okay, do you explain that a little bit more?
We would be Mexico.
It's self-explanatory, folks.
So what did I learn today? People don't know nearly enough about their history to know what they are celebrating. But when pressed, they realize they are not in fact free. But my biggest concern, do people know why it is we separated in the first place? If they did, they might not have such an issue with us being owned by Great Britain still. Throughout history, our leaders have violated every reason that the Founding Fathers wrote down for the original separation. Though this second documentary only shows a few, through the next years, I will show you why that separation has gone from meaning freedom to meaning nothing today. So, do you still want to celebrate Independence Day? If you know history, you sure won't.
Independence Day? It's on its way.